Imagine a crisp Friday evening where the air feels alive with anticipation. The Martin family, Henry, Linda, and their two children, Grace and Jordan, step out of their car dressed in their finest clothes. Tonight is a celebration. Henry and Linda's wedding anniversary, a milestone of love, commitment, and years of weathering life's storms together. The restaurant they've chosen isn't just any place, it's the talk of the town, renowned for its exclusivity, sophistication, and fine dining experience. As Henry, a man of quiet dignity, holds the door open for his family, Linda's heart flutters with excitement. She's dreamed of this evening for weeks. The kids are on their best behavior, sharing giggles and whispers, their laughter a melody of innocence. The restaurant's ambience, with its dim lighting and soft jazz playing in the background, feels like something out of a movie. The clinking of glasses, the murmurs of diners, and the scent of gourmet dishes set the stage for what should be a perfect evening. Henry steps confidently to the hostess stand, his reservation confirmation email tucked neatly in his pocket. Reservation for Martin. Table for 4, he says with a polite nod. But the hostess hesitates. There's a flicker of unease in her expression. And before she can respond, a sharply dressed man approaches. This is Mr. Whitman, the restaurant manager. His tailored suit and air of authority suggests he's someone who's used to being in charge. Yet, his smile is thin and forced, barely masking the coldness behind his eyes. I'm sorry, he says, his tone clipped. There seemed to be a mistake. We're fully booked tonight. Henry's brow furrows, his composure unshaken. That's strange, he replies evenly, gesturing towards several clearly empty tables. I confirmed our reservation this morning. Whitman's smile tightens as he delivers his next words with a thinly veiled edge. We prioritize regular clientele. Perhaps another establishment would better suit your needs. Linda's radiant smile falters. Grace and Jordan exchange puzzled glances, sensing the tension but not fully understanding its weight. The rejection hangs heavy in the air, cutting through the Martin family's excitement like a knife. Henry, ever the pillar of strength, takes Linda's hand and calmly turns to leave. But inside, his heart burns with frustration and hurt. Linda whispers, her voice trembling, "Why would they do this to us?" Henry doesn't respond, his jaw clenched as he pushes open the door. As the Martins step out into the cool evening, a strange hush falls over the bustling restaurant. Unbeknownst to them, their grace in the face of humiliation has not gone unnoticed. From across the dining room, a man with sharp eyes and an air of quiet authority has been observing everything. This man, Mr. Patterson, sits at a prime table near the window, his silver-streaked hair catching the glow of the chandeliers. He adjusts his jacket, his gaze never leaving the Martins as they approach the exit. And then, just as Henry reaches for the door, Patterson's voice cuts through the murmur of the room. "Excuse me," he calls out, his tone steady and commanding. The entire restaurant falls silent. Heads turn, conversations halt, and all eyes fix on Patterson. He rises from his seat, his movements deliberate and full of purpose, and begins to make his way toward the Martins. "Mr. Martin, is it?" Patterson asks, his voice calm yet carrying an unmistakable weight of authority. Henry, surprised but composed, nods. "Yes, I'm Henry Martin. Can I help you?" Patterson smiles faintly, though his eyes carry a seriousness that suggests this is no ordinary interaction. "Actually," he says, "I believe I can help you." The restaurant staff exchange nervous glances, none more so than Mr. Whitman, who stands frozen near the hostess stand, his face pale. Something monumental is about to happen, and everyone in the room can feel it. As the Martins turn their attention to Patterson, the man gestures toward one of the finest tables in the restaurant. "Please," he says warmly, "allow me to make this right." Henry hesitates, his instincts cautious, but Linda gives him a subtle nod, her curiosity piqued. The family follows Patterson as he leads them to the table, his demeanor exuding kindness and determination. But this is only the beginning. What Patterson has in store for the Martins will not only change their evening, it will alter the course of their lives forever. Stay tuned, because what happens next is a story of dignity, resilience, and an extraordinary twist that no one saw coming. The Martin family settled into their new seats, the table elegantly set with fine china and gleaming silverware. Grace and Jordan, though unsure of what was happening, were visibly excited by the turn of events. Linda glanced at Henry, her eyes questioning but hopeful. Henry, ever composed, nodded subtly, silently urging her to trust the situation. Mr. Patterson, still standing, gestured for a waiter. The staff, who had been nervously hovering at the edges of the room, sprang into action. A young man in a crisp white shirt arrived promptly, his demeanor both polite and apologetic. "Please bring the best bottle of sparkling cider you have," Patterson instructed, his tone firm but kind. "We're celebrating something special tonight." Henry raised an eyebrow, his curiosity deepening. "Mr. Patterson," he began cautiously, "we appreciate your kindness, but may I ask why you're doing this?" Patterson took his seat across from the family, his expression unreadable yet sincere. He rested his hands on the table, fingers interlaced, and leaned forward slightly. "Sometimes," he said, "when you see something wrong, you have to step in and make it right." There was a weight to his words, as though they carried a meaning far deeper than the situation at hand. Linda tilted her head, studying Patterson intently. "Do you own this restaurant?" she asked softly. A small smile tugged at the corner of Patterson's lips. "Not yet," he replied cryptically, his eyes briefly darting toward Mr. Whitman, who lingered awkwardly near the hostess stand. The manager's earlier confidence had evaporated, replaced by an uneasy tension as he watched the scene unfold. The waiter returned with a bottle of sparkling cider and poured it into the family's glasses. Patterson raised his glass first. "To the Martins," he said, his voice warm and steady. "May this evening remind you that dignity always triumphs over ignorance." The Martins exchanged glances before lifting their glasses in unison. The toast, though simple, carried a resonance that lingered in the air. As the family sipped their cider, Patterson leaned back in his chair, his demeanor shifting slightly. "I know you're wondering who I am and why I care about what just happened," he began. "So let me share a bit about myself." He paused, as if gathering his thoughts, and then continued. "I grew up not far from here, in a small house on the south side of town. My father worked long hours in a factory, and my mother took in sewing to make ends meet. We didn't have much, but we had each other, and we had values. My parents taught me to stand up for what's right, even when it's not easy." Henry listened intently, nodding in silent agreement. Patterson's story felt authentic, a glimpse into a life shaped by hard work and resilience. "I built my career in real estate," Patterson explained, his voice steady. "Started small, flipping old houses, and eventually worked my way up. Over the years, I've owned apartment complexes, office buildings, and even a few restaurants. I know this industry, and I know people like Whitman." At the mention of the manager's name, Linda's eyes flickered with understanding. Patterson was not a man to tolerate injustice lightly. "People like him," Patterson said, his tone hardening just slightly, "think they can judge others by the color of their skin or the weight of their wallets. They think power gives them the right to humiliate and exclude. They're wrong. Power isn't about control. It's about responsibility." The Martins sat in silence, the weight of Patterson's words settling over them. Grace, who had been quietly observing, spoke up for the first time. "Mr. Patterson," she said shyly, "why did you help us?" Patterson's expression softened as he looked at her. "Because, young lady," he said gently, "when you see something unfair, you don't just walk away. You stand up, even if it's uncomfortable, even if you're the only one doing it. That's what my parents taught me, and that's what I want to pass on to others." Henry leaned forward, his curiosity growing. "What are you planning to do about all this?" he asked, his tone measured. Patterson smiled faintly, but there was a glint of determination in his eyes. "Let's just say this isn't the last time Mr. Whitman will underestimate someone." As if on cue, Whitman approached the table, his expression strained. "Mr. Patterson," he said, his voice tight, "may I have a word with you privately?" Patterson didn't move from his seat. Anything you need to say can be said here, he replied calmly. Whitman hesitated, clearly uncomfortable. His gaze flickered to the Marktons, then back to Patterson. I wasn't aware you'd be dining with us tonight, he said, his tone almost apologetic. Had I known, I would have ensured everything was in order. Patterson's smile didn't waver. Funny how things get in order when someone like me walks in, he said, his voice carrying a quiet authority that left no room for argument. Whitman's face reddened, but he said nothing more. Patterson turned his attention back to the Marktons. Enjoy your meal, he said warmly. I'll take care of the rest. As the Marktons began to relax, the tension of the evening slowly giving way to gratitude and curiosity, Patterson excused himself and walked toward the back of the restaurant. The staff watched him with a mix of respect and apprehension, their whispers barely audible. What Patterson was about to do, the Marktons couldn't have predicted. And when they found out, it would leave them, and everyone else in the room, stunned. The kitchen door swung shut behind Mr. Patterson, and the Marktons exchanged puzzled glances. There was something magnetic about his presence, a quiet confidence that made them feel both reassured and curious. Linda leaned closer to Henry, her voice barely above a whisper. What do you think he's doing back there? She asked. Henry shook his head slowly. I don't know, but something tells me it's going to change things around here. Meanwhile, in the kitchen, Patterson stood before the staff, a mix of cooks, servers, and busboys who had gathered nervously. They seemed unsure whether he was there to reprimand them or deliver a command. The head chef, a stout man with a grease-stained apron, stepped forward. Mr. Patterson, he began cautiously, is everything all right? Patterson raised a hand, silencing him gently. I'm not here to blame any of you, he said firmly, but I need you to listen closely. What happened tonight is unacceptable. This establishment is built on serving people, not judging them. And that starts with the management, or, as it seems, the lack of it. The staff exchanged uneasy looks, their gazes drifting toward the dining room where Mr. Whitman had retreated. Patterson continued, his tone calm but commanding. This restaurant is more than a business. It's a community space, a place where families celebrate milestones, friends share laughter, and strangers are made to feel welcome. But tonight, it failed to live up to that purpose. One of the younger servers, a timid girl with a name tag that read Emily, spoke up hesitantly. We just follow orders, sir, she said, her voice trembling slightly. We didn't know what to do when Mr. Whitman told us not to seat them. Patterson's gaze softened as he looked at her. I understand, he said, his voice kinder now. But change starts with recognizing what's wrong and choosing to do better. From now on, this place will stand for something more, and you'll all be a part of it. Back in the dining area, the Marktons were finally starting to enjoy their meal. Plates of beautifully prepared dishes were brought to their table, each one more exquisite than the last. Grace and Jordan, their earlier apprehension fading, giggled over the fancy presentation of their desserts. But the atmosphere in the restaurant remained charged. Other diners, who had been quietly observing the unfolding events, began to whisper among themselves. Some looked uncomfortable, while others appeared intrigued. A few even cast encouraging smiles toward the Marktons, as if silently offering their support. Linda couldn't help but feel the weight of those stares. She leaned toward Henry and murmured, I feel like everyone's watching us. They are, Henry replied quietly, his tone measured. But maybe this is bigger than just us. At that moment, Patterson emerged from the kitchen, his expression calm but resolute. He walked straight to Mr. Whitman, who had been hovering near the entrance, pretending to check reservations. Whitman, Patterson said, his voice carrying across the room, we need to talk. The manager froze, his facade of confidence slipping. Of course, Mr. Patterson, he stammered, glancing nervously at the diners who were now openly watching. Patterson gestured toward the office door. In private. The two men disappeared into the small office, leaving the restaurant in a hushed anticipation. Conversation ceased, and even the clinking of silverware seemed to pause. The Marktons exchanged uncertain looks, their curiosity growing with each passing second. Inside the office, Whitman tried to regain his composure. Mr. Patterson, I assure you this was just a misunderstanding, he began, his voice desperate. I had no idea the situation would escalate like this. Patterson leaned against the desk, his arms crossed. Stop, he said firmly. Don't insult my intelligence. You knew exactly what you were doing. You thought no one would call you out. But tonight, you crossed a line. Whitman's face reddened. I was just trying to maintain the restaurant's image, he blurted defensively. Patterson's eyes narrowed. And you think that image is worth more than basic decency, than treating people with respect? He shook his head, his disappointment evident. This isn't about image, Whitman. It's about values. And clearly, yours don't align with mine. Whitman opened his mouth to respond, but Patterson cut him off. You're done here, he said, his tone final. As of tonight, you're no longer the manager of this restaurant. Whitman's jaw dropped, but he was too stunned to argue. Patterson turned toward the door, pausing briefly before opening it. Pack your things, he said over his shoulder, and don't make me regret letting you leave quietly. When Patterson stepped back into the dining room, the tension was palpable. He walked over to the Martins' table, his expression warm yet serious. I hope you're enjoying your meal, he said, his voice gentle but purposeful. Henry looked up at him, a mixture of gratitude and confusion in his eyes. Mr. Patterson, he said slowly, what just happened? Patterson smiled faintly. Let's just say some changes are being made, he replied. And you're part of the reason why. As the Martins tried to process his words, the rest of the diners erupted into quiet applause. It started with a single table, then spread throughout the room. The Martins looked around, their initial embarrassment giving way to a sense of pride. For the first time that night, they felt truly seen, not as an anomaly or an inconvenience, but as a family deserving of respect and dignity. But even as the applause died down, questions lingered in the air. What would happen next? And what did Patterson mean when he said the Martins were part of the reason for the changes? The answers, it seemed, were just beginning to unfold. As the applause faded, the energy in the restaurant shifted. A sense of curiosity buzzed through the room, and it wasn't just about the Martins anymore. People began to glance at Mr. Patterson, murmuring amongst themselves. The unexpected events of the evening had sparked a ripple of intrigue that no one could ignore. Patterson lingered by the Martins' table for a moment longer, his calm demeanor betraying no hint of the whirlwind brewing beneath the surface. Enjoy your meal, he said with a nod, then turned and walked toward the center of the dining room, where he cleared his throat to gather everyone's attention. The room grew quiet, all eyes now fixed on him. Ladies and gentlemen, he began, his voice steady but commanding, I'd like to thank you for your patience tonight. As you may have noticed, some things are changing around here. His words hung in the air, leaving everyone on edge. Some diners leaned forward in their seats, eager to hear more. Others glanced around, their curiosity mounting. Patterson's deliberate pause only heightened the suspense. I believe a restaurant should be more than just a place to eat, he continued. It should be a space where everyone feels welcome, where kindness, respect, and community come first. Tonight, I was reminded why those values matter. He glanced toward the Martins, and for a moment, their faces burned with a mixture of embarrassment and pride. Henry reached for Linda's hand under the table, squeezing it gently as if to say, Asterisk, we're in this together, asterisk. But change doesn't come easy, Patterson went on, his tone firm. And it certainly doesn't happen without accountability. The staff standing near the kitchen shifted uncomfortably, unsure of what was coming next. Emily, the young server, wrung her hands nervously, her eyes darting between Patterson and the diners. And so, Patterson said, his gaze sweeping across the room, it's time to start holding this establishment to a higher standard. That begins tonight. Before anyone could respond, the front door swung open, and a gust of cold air swept through the room. Two sharply dressed individuals, a man and a woman, stepped inside. They carried an air of authority that immediately commanded attention. Patterson turned toward them with a nod. Right on time, he said. The woman stepped forward, her heels clicking against the polished floor. Good evening, she said, her voice professional yet warm. "I'm Jessica Torres, legal counsel for Patterson Enterprises. And this," she gestured to the man beside her, "is Marcus Hill, our Director of Operations." The murmurs in the room grew louder. The name Patterson Enterprises clearly carried weight, and the realization seemed to ripple through the crowd like a shockwave. One of the diners leaned toward his companion and whispered, "That's the parent company. They own this place." Jessica Torres continued, addressing the room. "We're here tonight to make an announcement," she said. "Effective immediately, this restaurant will undergo a complete restructuring, starting with new leadership." Her words sent a jolt through the room. The staff exchanged anxious glances, and the diners sat in stunned silence. Linda leaned toward Henry, her voice barely above a whisper. "Do you think this has something to do with us?" Henry shook his head slowly, his expression unreadable. "I don't know," he said. "But something tells me we're about to find out." Patterson stepped forward again, his presence commanding attention. "For too long, this establishment has operated under outdated and unacceptable practices," he said. "Tonight, that ends." As if on cue, the office door creaked open, and Mr. Whitman emerged, his face pale and his shoulders slumped. He clutched a cardboard box filled with his belongings, the sight of it confirming what many had already suspected. The room seemed to hold its collective breath as Whitman shuffled toward the exit, avoiding eye contact with anyone. But just as he reached the door, Patterson spoke again. "And let this serve as a reminder," he said, his voice cutting through the silence, "that no one is above accountability, not even those at the top." Whitman paused for a fraction of a second, then pushed the door open and disappeared into the night. The tension in the room was nearly unbearable now, the weight of the evening's events pressing down on everyone. Jessica Torres stepped forward again, her professional demeanor unshaken. "We'll be working closely with the staff to ensure a smooth transition," she said. "But more importantly, we'll be focusing on creating an environment that reflects the values of Patterson Enterprises. An environment where everyone is treated with dignity and respect." Her words were met with a smattering of applause, hesitant at first but growing steadily. Some diners clapped politely, while others sat frozen in their seats, still processing everything that had unfolded. At the Martins' table, Jordan looked up at his parents, his young face filled with curiosity. "Does this mean it's going to be different now?" he asked. Linda smiled softly, brushing a strand of hair from his forehead. "I think it means a lot of things are going to change," she said. But even as the applause echoed through the room, a lingering sense of anticipation remained. Patterson hadn't yet explained why the Martins were at the center of it all, nor had he revealed what would happen next. The diners, the staff, and even the Martins themselves waited with bated breath, the weight of the unanswered questions hanging over them like a storm cloud. Something told them the climax was near, and whatever came next would be the turning point they had all been waiting for. As the applause subsided, the room fell into a charged silence. Patterson remained at the center of the room, his expression calm, but with a hint of something more beneath the surface. The Martins exchanged uneasy glances. Henry leaned forward slightly, as if bracing for whatever revelation was about to follow. Patterson looked around the dining room, his eyes briefly meeting those of each diner before he spoke. "Tonight isn't just about change for this restaurant," he said, his voice steady but weighted. "It's about acknowledging the wrongs that have been done and ensuring they're never repeated." His words landed heavily in the room, and for a moment, no one moved. Then, as if on cue, Jessica Torres stepped forward, holding a thin folder in her hands. She glanced at Patterson, who gave her a subtle nod before addressing the room. "We've conducted a thorough review of this restaurant's operations over the past year," Jessica began, her tone professional but pointed. "And what we've uncovered is troubling." A ripple of unease swept through the staff, particularly among the servers who had been present earlier. Emily's face turned pale, and her hands trembled slightly as she stood near the kitchen door. "The issues we've identified go beyond isolated incidents," Jessica continued. "They reveal a pattern, one of systemic mistreatment, both of employees and patrons." A murmur spread through the room, diners whispering to one another in hushed tones. Henry's jaw tightened, his gaze fixed on Patterson. Linda glanced at her children, her protective instincts on high alert. Jessica opened the folder and pulled out a single sheet of paper. "One of the most egregious examples occurred just last month," she said, her eyes scanning the document. "A family was turned away from this restaurant without justification, an action that directly violated company policy. That family was later identified as the Martins." Gasps echoed through the room as all eyes turned toward the Martins' table. Linda's face flushed with a mixture of embarrassment and defiance, while Henry's grip on the edge of the table tightened. Jordan looked up at his parents, his young face a mix of confusion and concern. "What's happening, Dad?" he whispered. Henry didn't answer immediately. Instead, he kept his focus on Patterson, who was now walking toward their table with a purposeful stride. When Patterson reached them, he placed a hand on the back of an empty chair, his expression softening. "Mr. and Mrs. Martin," he said, his voice carrying a quiet sincerity, "I owe you an apology on behalf of this restaurant and the values it has failed to uphold." Linda's lips parted as if to speak, but she seemed at a loss for words. Henry, ever the protector, finally found his voice. "Why now?" he asked, his tone steady but laced with suspicion. "Why are you doing this tonight?" Patterson hesitated for a fraction of a second, then pulled out a small envelope from his jacket pocket. He placed it on the table in front of Henry, the white paper stark against the polished wood. "Because tonight isn't just about making amends," Patterson said. "It's about setting things right and offering an opportunity for something better." Henry stared at the envelope, his brow furrowed. He reached for it slowly, as if expecting it to vanish before his eyes. When he opened it, his expression shifted from confusion to shock. Inside was a document, an official offer of ownership of the restaurant. The words at the top of the page made it clear. Patterson Enterprises was transferring full control of the establishment to the Martins. Linda gasped, her hand flying to her mouth. "This can't be real," she whispered. "It is," Patterson assured them. "This restaurant belongs to you now, not just as an apology, but as a chance to create something new, something that reflects the values you hold dear." The room erupted into murmurs, the weight of the revelation rippling through the diners and staff alike. Emily, still standing near the kitchen, looked as though she might faint. But just as the Martins began to process the gravity of what was happening, a loud voice cut through the noise. "This is ridiculous." All eyes turned toward the back of the room, where a middle-aged man in a suit stood with an air of authority. It was Mr. Whitman, who had apparently lingered outside the restaurant long enough to overhear the announcement. "You can't just hand over this restaurant to them," Whitman exclaimed, his face flushed with anger. "This place has a legacy, a reputation." "A reputation that you tarnished," Patterson interrupted, his voice sharper than before. "Your actions are exactly why this change is necessary." Whitman took a step forward, his fists clenched. "This isn't over," he warned, his gaze darting between Patterson and the Martins. "You'll regret this." The tension in the room reached a fever pitch as Whitman stormed out, slamming the door behind him. For a moment, no one spoke, the echoes of his departure lingering in the air. Henry looked at Patterson, his expression unreadable. "What happens now?" he asked. Patterson smiled faintly, the weight of the evening evident in his eyes. "That's up to you," he said. "But whatever you choose in of this, tonight is only the beginning." The room remained silent, the promise of what lay ahead hanging in the air like a storm cloud about to burst. The Martins had been given an extraordinary opportunity, but the path forward was far from clear. And as the diners and staff watched, they couldn't shake the feeling that the story was far from over. The room seemed to hold its breath as Henry sat back, the envelope still in his hand, its contents confirming a truth too surreal to fully grasp. Linda's hand trembled as she reached out, brushing against her husband's arm. For a moment, their world had shifted, the weight of years of struggle giving way to something unrecognizable. A chance, a change, an opportunity they had never dared imagine. Patterson stood silent, his gaze steady as he observed the family. He didn't press them for an answer, didn't force them into immediate decisions. He simply allowed the moment to settle, knowing the gravity of what he'd set into motion. But as the tension began to wane, a voice broke through, soft but piercing its tone. "Why us?" Linda asked, her voice tinged with both gratitude and suspicion. "You could have chosen anyone. Why did you choose us?" Patterson's expression softened, and for the first time that evening, his carefully measured demeanor cracked. There was something deeply personal in his eyes now, a flicker of vulnerability that seemed almost out of place. He hesitated, then took a deep breath. "Because you remind me of someone I once knew," he admitted. "Someone who deserved better than what this world gave them. And I couldn't help them when they needed me most." The room fell silent again, Patterson's words echoing with an unexpected poignancy. The diners and staff watched, their curiosity mingling with a newfound respect for the man who had orchestrated the evening. But before anyone could respond, the restaurant's front doors burst open with a loud crash. All heads turned as Whitman stormed back in, flanked by two men in dark suits. His face was twisted with fury, his earlier threats now manifesting a confrontation that no one had anticipated. "This isn't over," Whitman snarled, his voice cutting through the room like a knife. "You think you can just hand this place over to them? Over my dead body?" Patterson stepped forward, his expression calm but resolute. "You've made your position clear, Whitman," he said, "but this isn't your decision to make anymore." Whitman's lip curled into a sneer. "We'll see about that," he spat. He gestured to the men beside him, who began advancing toward Patterson with an air of intimidation. The tension in the room reached its breaking point. Linda instinctively pulled her children closer, her heart pounding as she glanced at Henry, who was already rising from his chair. The diners watched in stunned silence, unsure of what would happen next. But just as the confrontation seemed poised to escalate, a voice rang out from the back of the room, clear, steady, and full of authority. "That's enough." All eyes turned to see Emily stepping forward, a trembling earlier replaced by a quiet determination. She held up her phone, its screen lit with a video recording. "I've been filming everything," she said, her voice gaining strength with each word. "Every word you said tonight, every threat you've made, and I'm not the only one who's seen it." Whitman froze, his bravado faltering, as he realized the implications of her words. The men beside him hesitated, their confidence shaken. "You think you can bully your way out of this?" Emily continued, her voice unwavering. "Not anymore. The world will see you for who you really are." A murmur of approval swept through the room, the diners and staff rallying behind her bravery. Whitman's face twisted with anger, but he knew he'd been cornered. With a final glare at Patterson and the Martins, he turned and stormed out, his companions trailing behind him. The doors closed with a resounding thud, and for a moment the room was eerily quiet. Then slowly the tension began to dissipate, replaced by a palpable sense of relief and triumph. Patterson turned to Emily, a look of genuine gratitude on his face. "Thank you," he said simply. She nodded, her expression a mix of pride and disbelief at her own actions. "It was the right thing to do," she said. Henry sat back down, his shoulders finally relaxing. He looked at Linda, who gave him a small, tentative smile. For the first time that evening, they felt a glimmer of hope, not just for themselves, but for what this moment represented. But just as they thought the night had reached its conclusion, Patterson spoke again, his tone carrying a note of finality. "There's one more thing," he said, drawing everyone's attention. He reached into his pocket and pulled out another envelope identical to the first. This time he handed it to Emily. "This isn't just about the Martins," he said. "It's about everyone who's been wronged by this place. Emily, I want you to manage the restaurant alongside them. Together, I think you'll create something extraordinary." Emily's eyes widened in shock, her hands trembling as she took the envelope. "I don't know what to say," she stammered. "Say you'll do it," Patterson said with a small smile. Emily looked at the Martins, who nodded encouragingly. Finally, she took a deep breath and said, "Okay, I'll do it." The room erupted into applause, the diners and staff celebrating the unexpected turn of events. The Martins and Emily exchanged grateful smiles, their partnership a symbol of hope and resilience. And as the night drew to a close, the restaurant felt different. No longer a place of division and pain, but one of unity and possibility. The journey ahead would be challenging, but for the first time, it felt like a future worth fighting for.